What we're now looking to do is to take the F2 syllabus that we know and revise what we have to do in exam conditions. The key with F2, regardless of whether you intend to do F2 as a written paper or as a CBE, is that you have limited time in which to do a lot of questions. You typically have 40 2-mark questions and a further 10 1-mark questions. Now, a lot of people get very excited about the limited time that you have. And of course, with the limited time, you have to try and get to the very end of the exam. But my view, based on my experience of practicing these questions, but also the experience of many students that have passed through my hands, is that if you know what you are doing with regard to the F2 syllabus, you should have no time with completing all the questions. Please note, it is all about knowledge. If you don't know something, you're not going to sit there on a question waiting for something to happen. If you don't know it when you go into the exam, you're going to have to leave that question and maybe come back to it at the end. There are other things that you can do to help yourselves. Please note that there is always going to be a mix of more complicated questions and less complicated questions. And from that perspective, if you think that the question is going to take you a long period of time, leave it and come back to it. If it is a discursive question, i.e. there are no numbers, whether you know it or you don't know it, at least you can answer that question quickly. Either by knowing the answer, fantastic, you get that straight off, or in the event that you're not quite sure, please note that when you look at the answers, you're typically given a choice out of 4, or possibly even a choice out of 3 or 2. And from that perspective, if you don't know the correct answer, at least make sure that you eliminate the obvious non-correct answers. Other things that we could consider will include such thoughts as these. When you look at the questions, my view of F2 and any of these papers at the knowledge level is simply this. You must read the question, and particularly the requirement, very carefully indeed. My view is that a lot of these questions are more about comprehension than detailed knowledge. In fact, a lot of people tend to get them wrong, even if they know the right answer, because they have failed to read the question correctly. So make sure that you read from the requirement first, if possible. Back into the question to see the information that's given to you. Please note that the examiners have gone through a rigorous process when they have set these questions. And so you have to look at specifically the angle that they are trying to get out of the question in order to make sure that you do it correctly. So let's just recap very briefly on precisely what it is that we have to do. Firstly, leave difficult questions until the end. Because remember, you would expect, what, 3, 4, 5 of these questions to take quite a considerable amount of time, whereas other questions will take far less time. Secondly, if in doubt, make an educated guess. An educated guess uses the limited knowledge that you have and eliminates the obvious incorrect elements. If you can narrow it down from 4 to 3, you've suddenly got a 1 in 3 chance. If you can narrow it down from 3 to 2, you've got a 1 in 2 chance. And maybe by eliminating what are described in the trade as distractor answers, you're left with 2 from which you have a far better understanding of which is more likely to be the correct answer. Remember, there is no excuse for a lack of knowledge, but when we're looking at the F2 paper, the chances are that some of these questions will be from the very edge of the syllabus. And as such, you only have to look at the examiner's own comments on past papers to appreciate that some of these questions are really quite tough. Focus on the more straightforward questions and you should have far less difficulty in getting a solid pass mark. Now, what are we going to do on the revision phase? Well, what I want to look at is the pilot paper, which is the only facility open to us to show us precisely what your examiner wants to set in the exam. Please note that these specific questions are unlikely to be repeated. But there is a limit to the degree of different questions that the examiner may set. Given that we've done the pilot paper to learn the technique, and we've learnt all the techniques during the course, we're well on our way to a healthy position in order to practice doing the exam and getting a solid pass mark. So, what you need to do is to open the pilot paper for F2. To do this, you go to the ACCA Global website. I'm hoping you are familiar with that already. And I would simply search Pilot Paper F2 within that website. Once you've got that, you're able to download that as a PDF. It's one of those freely available pieces of information given to you by the ACCA. Interestingly, the ACCA gives you not just the questions for the pilot paper, but also the full answers and detail behind some of those answers. Now, we're going to work through them, but of course that gives you a resource that you were able to look at yourself in your own time. My idea of looking at the pilot paper is to answer the question as set. But hold on a moment, I'm not just going to look at answering the question as set. With every single question, if appropriate, what I'm going to do is to highlight the technique and method, precisely the area of the syllabus, and if there is something interesting about the question, that it is a wider point, I will also look at that. But I'm only going to look at that if I have already answered the question. Whenever we look at these questions, we must always focus on the core question itself before we do anything more fancy. So let's get down to business. What we should have is a paper that looks something like this. We have management accounting on the front, and if you can see in this very fancy way of writing, we have paper F2 up the right hand side. What would we notice from this? Well, the first thing we notice is time allowed. Two hours allowed. All 50 questions are compulsory and must be attempted. Well, yes, it doesn't matter how good or bad you are at specific questions. In the exam, you must make sure that you attempt everything, even if it's a guess. Remember, even if there are 4 answers, you've got a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. Right, let's get down to business. Very first question. Now, if we look at this question here, we're given a graph, that's all well and good. The first thing we want to focus on is the requirement. What is the margin of safety at the 1,700 units level of activity? Well, okay, I hope you appreciate that margin of safety is all about break-even analysis. We're helped a bit because if we read at the top, we're given a lot more information. The following break-even chart has been drawn showing the total cost line, the total variable cost line, the total fixed cost line, and the total sales revenue. Well, okay, let's answer the question first of all, and then we'll come back and talk about other things that we're given here that we may have to play with. We're looking at break-even analysis. And I hope you remember that if we're looking at the margin of safety, what we're looking at is the difference between budgeted sales, the sales that we expected to achieve, and break-even sales. Now, the margin of safety could be expressed as a percentage or in absolute terms. And I suppose in absolute terms it could be expressed in either units or in revenue or value terms. So the margin of safety could be in units, could be in revenue, or as a percentage. And if we were to calculate the margin of safety as a percentage, we would take it as a percentage of the budgeted value, just to remind you of that fact. Break-even sales. Well, I hope you all remember that break-even sales is where there is neither a profit or a loss. If you wish, costs, be they fixed or variable, equals revenue. So, with those mind-blowing observations, let's go away and think about the sort of thing that we're given in the diagram. To me, I would immediately be drawn to try and establish the break-even point here. I don't think it's too difficult. The break-even point arises at the point at which the sales revenue equals the total cost. What we find here is that the break-even point is at 1,200. We're told specifically the level of activity that we intend to use, 1,700. And therefore, a very nice and easy answer here, presumably the margin of safety is the difference between those two of 500 units. So, a very nice question to begin with. We can immediately say that the answer is C. Fine. Please note, if we're a bit unsure here, we could have used these numbers A, B, C and D, 200, 300, 500, 1,025 units, to help us understand what's going on. In this particular question, however, I don't think it was necessary. Before we leave this graph, because these graphs are quite common, it appears, with the examiner, what other things could we pick up from our graph? Well, maybe what we could look at are other things that the examiner may want to illustrate. For example, if we were to look at the difference between sales revenue and variable cost, what would that give us? Well, I hope you're shouting it would give us contribution. And therefore, if we were looking at, say, this amount here, that would give us a contribution value. Likewise, if we were to look at anywhere above in this area here, this relates to some sort of profit figure. And anywhere below this sort of area down here, this would represent some sort of loss area. So these are the sort of things that the examiner could ask us. Can we establish the fixed cost here? Well, I'm hoping that the fixed cost is not too difficult at all, on the basis that the fixed cost is going to relate to the total fixed cost here, therefore it will be the point between this point and this point here. So be ready to make sure you can pick out precisely what it is that the examiner wants you to talk about, because these sorts of graphs seem to be coming up again and again in your exam. To me, this is a nice question, a great starting point. So, we've got 2 marks in the bag, and that's one of the things that I always like to think about when I'm looking at these questions here. Every nice and straightforward question, 2 marks in the bag. How many marks do we need to get? Well, we need to get enough to get 50% and more. Right, let's move on. Question 2. The requirement is which of the following statements are true? Well, okay, always be careful here, Make sure it says they are true rather than are not true or are false. Make sure you read it very carefully indeed. The following assertions relate to financial accounting and cost accounting. Firstly, the main users of financial accounting information are external to an organisation. What do you think? Well, I would be inclined to say that I am happy with that. Because one of the key things that we identify when we're looking at F2, and I suppose F3 as well, is who uses the management accounting information and who uses the financial accounting information. The management accounting information is used internally by managers to allow them to manage, if you wish. I don't know if you remember, but we talked about management accounting being about preparing costing information, allowing us to plan and control, and also allowing us to make decisions. If we were looking at the financial accountant, we would say yes, their core role, and that's what we've said here, is external. They are preparing information for preparation of the final statutory accounts. And the users of statutory accounts, at least in the main, are external to the organisation. Traditionally, they are the shareholders, but of course there are many other stakeholders who may be interested in looking at these. So, my view is yes, I'm happy with the first one. Secondly, cost accounting is that part of financial accounting which records the cash received and payments made by an organisation. That part of financial accounting. So the suggestion here is that cost accounting is a small part of the wider financial accounts. Well, I would argue that that is not the case. Cost accounting is to do with management accounting, internal use, and financial accounting is something else. Now, you could argue, of course, that the cost accountant does prepare information that is used by the financial accountant. But I would talk about side by side rather than one being part of another. The other thing that I don't like here is that we talk about cash received and payments. So it suggests that maybe we're focused on some sort of cash basis. Now, we may do that from a management accounting perspective, but there's no reason why we would have to do it that way. We could prepare, and it's quite likely that we will prepare management accounts normally on an accruals basis, in a similar, although maybe not exactly the same way as the financial accountant. So, my answer to the second one is no. Now we come to the situation where we hope that this holds true in our answer. You see, it can't be A on that basis. It can be B and it can't be C. Fantastic. So I would go with B. Now, of course, the scary matter is this. If we were unhappy about the answer there and we couldn't find the correct answer, we would then have to go back to the assertions made above and decide which ones we are truly happy with and which ones we are less happy with. And maybe what you will find, and it happens again and again, this, is that you did not read the sentence carefully enough. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you read the sentence very carefully indeed. Remember, it's as much about comprehension as it is about knowledge of cost accounting here. Let's move on. We have a further mark in the bank. Please note, if you are only given 3 choices, or even 2 choices, true or false, there will only ever be 1 mark available. If you're given 4 choices, you'll be given 2 marks by the examiner. I'm simply telling you facts here. You'll notice this with any exam that you do. We look at question 3. When we consider question 3, it sends a shiver down my spine. What is the value of A in the equation for the line of best fit to 2 decimal places? So we know immediately what it is that we have to prepare. Reading on, it gets a little bit more disconcerting. Regression analysis is being used to find the line of best fit, y equals A plus bx, from 11 pairs of data. Now, I'm thinking that we're going to have a lot of work to do. Please remember, when we're looking at regression analysis, we have two rather weighty formulae that we have to play with. Now, don't worry, we don't have to remember those formulae. In fact, before we go any further with this question, let's go away and just establish what information you are given by the examiner that you can use. At the end of the questions, you have a formulae sheet. And when we look at the formulae sheet, we have a regression analysis formula for A and a regression analysis formula for B. Fantastic. We're also given a correlation coefficient formula that gives us a value R. Below that, there's not much else that we're given. We're given an economic order quantity, where we establish Q, and we get an economic batch quantity as well. So, nothing too exciting here. Now, what's scaring me is that I'm going to have to do all of this working and all of this working. But please note, your examiner is highly unlikely to give you pairs of data and ask you to do all of this. I'm hoping you've worked through a regression analysis example, just to see how it works. But in the exam, you've got a maximum of 2 marks, which equates to what? 3 or 4 minutes to do this in. And as such, they cannot expect you to do the full analysis. Given that, I would expect at the very least you're going to be given most of the components. But what scares me here is that we are specifically asked for A. And if we're asked for A, please note that within the A formula, you need B. So I'm thinking that in order to calculate A, I'm going to have to do all of the second formula in order to be able to do the first formula. Oh, okay then. Well, are my fears justified? Let's go back and look at the question that we've been set. Let's look at the information. The calculations have produced the following information. So we've got the sum of x, fine. We've got the sum of y. We've got the sum of x squared. And we've got the sum of y squared. Oh, we've also got the sum of xy. So we've got all of the key pieces of information that we may use for any of these formulae. Either the B formulae, or the A formulae, or the correlation coefficient R formulae as well. But very importantly, we are given B. Because we're given B, we don't have to calculate it. And that makes our life enormously easier than it otherwise would be. All of those fears I had before about having to do the B formulae before we got the A formulae have been dispelled. Please note that this will happen time and again. Now, I'm going to answer the question, and then we're going to come back and play with the numbers for all of the formulae that we could possibly calculate. Because, of course, we need that practice. So, if we look at regression analysis, let's answer the question first of all. We might as well get it out of the way. We have our A formulae. A equals the sum of y divided by n minus B, the sum of x divided by n. And all we have to do is to pluck the numbers out and throw them in. Not at all difficult, I hope. So what have we got here? The sum of y was 330, divided by n, the number of pairs of data, 11, minus B. We were specifically given this to make life easy for ourselves. 0.69171 multiplied by 440 over 11. Now, slot this into your calculator. Make sure that you can sort this one out. I'm hoping that once you've done the computation, you establish that it comes to 2.33. Make sure you have the calculator skills here. I'm not suggesting it's difficult, but it's something that I want you to be able to do as second nature. If you know how your calculator works, you have a skill. and it means you can concentrate on the question rather than being worried that you don't quite know the logic that your calculator uses. Please note, if you have a modern scientific calculator, the modern scientific calculator has what I would describe as computer logic, and that means that it should work the numbers providing you put them in the appropriate order. Any older calculator or non-scientific calculator you have to be slightly more careful with, because, for example, and maybe this is not a perfect example, you may have to work two separate numbers here in order to make sure that your calculator understands how you're working it. I suppose the moral of the story is that you must get a modern scientific calculator. I don't think that's too difficult to identify or find anywhere in the world. Right, so we've established the value for A. Hopefully I'm able to answer the question. And yes, the question was the answer was 2.33, and that correlates with the value that we have here. We can go for C. But given that we've got this information here, why don't we just go one further step? I know it wasn't asked for, but it could easily be asked for. What we may be asked to calculate is the value for B. And if we're looking at the value for B, well, let's get the B formula up. N, the sum of xy, minus the sum of x multiplied by the sum of y, divided through by n, the sum of x squared, minus the sum of x all squared. Therefore, if we're looking for a value for B, let's just pump those numbers in that we already know. N, we said, was 11. Somewhere in the question we were told that the sum of x multiplied by y was 13,467 minus 440 multiplied by 330. And we divide through by n, we know is 11, multiplied by the sum of x squared, 17,986 minus 440 squared. If we do this working, remember it wasn't required, we should come to the answer that we already have. Just check that you can do that, because of course in your exam you may easily get a question that requires you to calculate the B value. Okay. So we've looked a little bit at these questions, and all I wanted to show you with this regression question is that although you need to know the bigger picture, you're going to be asked for a very specific part of something to do with regression. Either the calculation of A, or the calculation of B, or maybe forecasting using the formula y equals a plus bx, and we'll see that later, or considering correlation or even determination. So we've looked at one aspect of it, and that's what I want to do on revision. Just pick up and look at the wider consideration associated with maybe a relatively small requirement. Our next question, question 4. What is the economic order quantity for the stock item to the nearest whole unit? Wow! As soon as I see that, I remember that I have a formula in my formula sheet. I'm not going to bother looking at it. The formula is Q equals the square root of 2 cod over chips, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Fine. Now, this is a 2 marker. We've just got to be slightly careful that your examiner may decide to give you the information in a slightly awkward way. Let's read through. The purchase price of the stock item is $25 per unit. Is the purchase price required in the formula? Well, the answer is no. But of course, the purchase price could be forming the basis of one of those costs, either CH or CO, that we have in the order. In each 3-month period, the usage of the item is 20,000 units. Well, okay, so that's going to give us some sort of demand figure, isn't it? Fine. Got to be slightly careful. The annual holding costs associated with one unit equate to 6% of its purchase price. So we've got this 6% here, and that means if we're going for 6% of 25, couldn't we say that that comes to something like $1.5? Check that one out. Please don't trust me to get these sort of calculations right. And that $1.5 is going to be a holding cost. Isn't that going to equal CH in some way? So when I read through, I always try and bring numbers together if I can easily. The cost of placing an order for the item is $20. So we've got CO. Now, that's rather good. We've got CO, we needed that. We've got D, we needed that. And we've got CH. Could we simply combine those three lots of numbers and get the right answer? Well, think about it for a moment. Make sure that you're reading all of this question carefully enough. Have you thought about it? Well, okay, let's just look a bit more carefully at the information that we're given. We have a 3-month period for the demand. But when we look at the holding costs, they are for 1 year. As such, we cannot directly compare one with the other. We have to equate them over the same period of time. And I suppose the obvious way of doing that is to say, well, hold on a moment, there are 4 3-month periods or quarters in each year. And therefore, if we were looking at annual demand, it's 80,000 units. So, I've got a bit messy here, but this in essence is what you're going to do in the exam. You're going to read through and you're going to do the answer on the face of the question. And as such, you've got to think it through, and then once you've got the information there, you can then pump it into the formula. Q equals the square root of 2 multiplied by, well, do we have CO, the cost per order? Well, CO we were given at the bottom was 20. Do we have D, the usage or demand for the period? Well, we have it now for 1 year, 80,000. And do we have CH, the cost of holding 1 unit for the period, in this case 1 year? Well, yes, we've established it at 1.5. Now, my view is this. Providing you've done absolute basic workings in this area, you should easily be able to do an EOQ. But my guess is that a sizable minority of students will have got that figure wrong. Make sure you don't. It is the classic thing that the examiner does with the economic order quantity. The examiner will give you just enough information for you to hang yourselves by giving the information in 2 different ways. Here we were given what? The demand over 3 months and the holding cost over 1 year. Remember, comprehension is the name of the game here. Read the question carefully, get the right answer. So, what does the answer become? Well, I'm guessing that the answer comes to 1461. Now, please note, in these games, it's likely that you may get a slight rounding error. But the examiner should have thought of that when it comes to the answer. So it should come to something very close to what you see in A and B and C and D. If you don't get that, you've obviously done something wrong. And my thoughts are you've got to go back to the beginning, because if you try and reread the question just by looking at little bits, you don't tend to pick up on the silly error that you made earlier. Okay. Question 5. What's the requirement? If we're looking at the requirement, by how much was the total overhead under or over absorbed for the period? Right, well, this is all about under-over absorption, very straightforward. Shall we just go away and talk about the theory before we go any further? If I were to look at under over absorption, the way I look at it is simply this. I wish to compare the overhead absorbed to the overhead incurred. Now, whatever happens, you talk about absorbed and incurred. Never talk about budget and actual. If you do that, you'll get it wrong. Now, the overhead incurred is just a figure that we are given. It's the, if you wish, actual overhead incurred. Very straightforward. But when we look at the overhead absorbed, where do we get that from? Well, we take our overhead absorption rate and we multiply by the actual activity. The actual number of hours or units worked or produced. Now, I suppose if we've got that far, fine. We can talk about how the numbers work in a moment, but we have to go one step back and say, how do we calculate an overhead absorption rate? And if we're looking at an overhead absorption rate, we should all be shouting at the screen and saying that the overhead absorption rate is the budgeted overhead cost divided through by the budgeted level of activity, or L of A, as I suggest it there. So those are the two bits of information that we need to know. Now, that being the case, I suppose we need the overhead absorption rate before we can go anywhere else. Let's go back to the question and see the sort of information that the examiner has given us. A company uses an overhead absorption rate of 3.5 per machine hour, based on 32,000 budgeted machine hours. Well, okay, we'll come back and talk about this in more detail in a moment, but I suppose what we're saying is this. What we're told is that the overhead absorption rate is 3.5 and the budgeted level of activity was 32,000 machine hours. I suppose if we wanted to, not that we need to of course, we could establish the budgeted overhead cost. The fact is that we already have the piece of information that we need for under-over absorption to slot up top. So, if we look at our overhead absorption rate, we have 3.5. Fine. So we're pretty close to success, health, wealth, and possibly even happiness. Reading on. During the same period, the actual total overhead expenditure was 108,875. And 30,000 machine hours were recorded on actual production. Fine. Well, hold on a moment. Haven't we got everything that we need there? So, actual activity, should we do that one first? Was 30,000. Overhead incurred was 108,875. If we multiply 3.5 by 30,000, we get 105,000. So the difference is 3,875. Right, well immediately we've got that difference. We're pretty close to success here. Let's just go back and see if there's just one value of 3,875 there. So we now know that the answer is either A or C. Yeah, we're pretty close, but we're not quite there yet. I suppose what we have to do is to understand whether it's under or over absorbed. Well, let's just think about what this all means. If we look at the numbers that we've calculated here, what is overhead absorbed? Well, overhead absorbed is the amount of overhead that we actually charged to the product and hence to the income statement. Overhead incurred, what's that? Well, that's the amount that we should have charged to the income statement. That's how much we've actually spent. So we should have charged 108,000 and we actually charged 105,000. So what's the adjustment? Are we going to increase or decrease the amount of overhead charged to the income statement? Well, yes, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to increase the amount charged to the income statement by this amount. Is that an under or an over absorption? Well, we have absorbed too little. As such, this is an under absorption. Now, a little thought before we leave it here. What does under absorption mean? Well, you could just say it is a correction for the fact that we have absorbed too little. But the upshot of under absorption is this. We are charging more cost to the income statement. If we're charging more cost to the income statement, costs rise and hence our profit will fall. Therefore, an underabsorption will lead to an adjustment that reduces profit. And that's something that you may need to know. Not that you needed to know in this particular question. We have our underabsorption. Therefore, if we go back, what we're able to say is that the answer was A rather than C. Now, I would expect an under-over absorption question to come up every time in the exam. And it may come up in more than one guise during the exam. So be ready for it. These are bread and butter marks that you must get. In recap, if we're looking at under-over absorption, this is the working that you need. The overhead absorbed compared to overhead incurred. It's very possible that you will need to calculate an overhead absorption rate first of all. Here we could work backwards to establish the budgeted overhead cost, but as we've already established, we were given the overhead absorption rate without having to do so. Be very, very clear about what these things mean, because you may be asked about whether the under-over absorption will increase or decrease profits. We have an under absorption here. That means that too little money has been charged to the income statement. We have to increase the costs in the income statement. If we increase the costs, that will reduce the profit. Okay, a classic question. Be ready for it. Now, we come to question 6, and I'm almost lost for words. We have to read this one carefully to make sure that we're not going to make a silly error, but is it really that easy? Let's read. For which of the following is a profit centre manager responsible? Now, call me a jaded but simple management accountant. What is profit? Unlike a financial accountant, to me, profit is very simply cost and revenue. Revenue minus cost gives us profit. Is that right? Sounds good to me. So we know it's not cost only or revenue only. I think it's a mix of the two. This is not rocket science, but please note we were only going to score 1 mark for the pleasure. So a nice easy mark. Okay, very nice, very easy. But I cannot emphasize enough that in your exam, if you can get the easy questions such as these right, and the moderately difficult ones correct, you will easily get enough marks. There will always be questions that are tough. And yes, I would love you to get those questions right, but it's not the way that you're going to pass this paper. The way you pass this paper is by getting the easy and moderately difficult stuff correct. The other stuff will get you to a prize if you are so lucky. Let's move on. Question 7. What's going on in question 7? What is the total cost of an activity of 20,000 units? Well, okay, so presumably what we're doing is some sort of forecasting action, and we just got to understand where this forecasting will come from. I mean, it could be a bit of regression analysis, but let's just look here. An organisation has the following total costs at 2 levels of activity. Right, as soon as I see this, I immediately think high-low method. Because we've only got two pairs of data, we're looking at simple ways of separating variable from fixed, on the basis that variable costs vary proportionately with activity and fixed costs are, well, they're fixed, they remain constant. So we've got the information here, activity levels 16,000 and 22,000, total cost 135 and 170. Now, we best read the next bit to make sure that we don't make a silly error. Variable cost per unit is constant within this range of activity, but there is a step of $5,000 in the total fixed costs when the activity exceeds 17,500 units. So, not a difficulty, but something that we've got to be ready for. Well, okay, I feel duty bound here to draw a pretty diagram to make sure that we're all happy about what's going on. You see, what we have is we have a situation where we have one level of activity and its associated costs, and we have another level of activity and its associated costs. The issue, however, is that there is a step between the two. Now, given that we have a step, are we able to use the high-low method? And the answer is, not easily. So what I'm inclined to do is simply this. I'm simply going to use the same information that the examiner is giving us, but I'm going to ignore the step cost to begin with. And if I ignore the step cost, I can then quite easily use the high-low method to separate the variable from the fixed cost. So, if we're looking at the high level of activity, all I'm going to do is to strip out the step and hence illustrate it as though there was no step. Now, if that's the case, how is this going to work? Well, okay, very easily here. Let's just write it up again, although I'm sure you wouldn't have to write this out yourself in the exam. You've got your activity levels and you've got your cost. And we said that the activity levels were 16,000 and 22,000. The costs were 135,000 and 170,000. All I'm going to do to make life easier is say, when we look at the second level of activity, we have included in that cost £5,000 step costs. Let's just strip those out first of all, and we end up with something like that. Now, once we've got that far, it is incredibly easy for us to then separate the variable from the fixed cost. Let's remind ourselves of how it works. If we want our variable cost per unit, what we do is we take the difference between the two costs. We take the difference between the two costs on the basis that any difference must be due to a change in the level of activity and hence is variable. And we divide through by the difference in the levels of activity. So we get 30,000 divided through by 6,000. Ooh, not too bad. We end up with $5 per unit. Now, once we've got our variable element, fine. Then we can easily establish our fixed cost. We know that the fixed cost equals the total cost minus the variable cost. Now we have to be careful here because remember we are ignoring the step cost. But don't worry, we can add it in if necessary later on. Let's go for the high level of activity. You don't have to, but I always do. At the high level of activity, the total cost was 165,000. At the high level of activity, we had 22,000 units, each of $5. Therefore, we end up with a fixed cost of 165,000 minus 110,000. We end up with a fixed cost of 55,000. Now, given that we've got those two elements, we can now answer the question. Should we go back to the question and decide what it is that the examiner really wants of us? We were asked, what is the total cost of an activity of 20,000 units? Well, please remember that the step cost arises when activity exceeds 17,500 units. So all we would have to say here to get the answer is the total cost will be made up of the variable element, the fixed element, and the stepped fixed cost as well. The variable cost, $5 per unit for 20,000 units. 100,000, I think. The fixed cost, a single figure, 55,000. And the step fixed cost, well, we were told it was 5,000. We sum the lot, 160,000, and now we glance apprehensively to our left and see whether that figure exists. Whew! That was lucky. The answer is C. In fact, C seems to be the answer for a lot of these questions this time. But of course, we would expect it to even out. So, we've managed now to deal with 7 of the 50 questions. Even with my descriptions, we're not taking that long to do these. Remember, if you know what you're doing, time is not an issue. Don't get too worried. We do have to work under a time constraint, but I'm expecting you to be able to do the questions in the time available. Let's move on.